People like to believe that when a judge delivers a verdict, life settles back into place, that the sound of a gavel marks an ending, clean and final. But at Mirror Lake, the ruling did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of quiet, one that felt fragile, as if it could crack at any moment. In the weeks after the decision, the lake looked the same as it always had. The water still caught the morning light. The pines still swayed gently along the shoreline, but the people had changed. Smiles came slower, conversations ended more quickly. Neighbors who once stopped to talk now offered polite nods and kept walking. Justice had been served, but it had also disturbed something that had been buried for years. At first, the silence felt like relief. No more warning letters taped to doors. No more threatening emails from the HOA. No more sudden inspections or invented violations. For the first time in a long while, I slept through the night without expecting my phone to buzz with bad news. Then, 2 weeks after the verdict, the phone rang. It was Tommy. His voice was calm, but I could hear the caution beneath it. "I want you to hear this from me first," he said. "Cordelia has filed an appeal." I didn't answer right away. I stood on the dock, looking out across the water, letting the words settle. An appeal did not mean she would win. Tommy explained that clearly. The legal grounds were thin, the evidence was overwhelming, but appeals had a different purpose. Delay. Delay meant uncertainty. Delay meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Delay meant reminding everyone that the past was not done with us yet. "She's trying to run out the clock," Tommy said, "and she's hoping the community gets tired." That night I realized something important. Winning in court does not always mean winning in life. Sometimes it simply changes the shape of the fight. Within days, the mood around Mirror Lake shifted again. Whispers started, quiet comments at the post office, careful conversations in grocery store aisles. Some people began to say things like, "Maybe this has gone far enough," or "At some point we have to think about property values." Those words hurt more than the threats ever had, because they suggested that peace mattered more than truth. Mavis Lane came by one afternoon with a loaf of bread she'd baked herself, the way she always did when something weighed on her. She sat at my kitchen table and sighed. "You did the right thing," she said firmly, "but don't be surprised if not everyone thanks you for it." She explained what she was hearing from others. Some residents were afraid the appeal and the investigation would drag the community's name through the mud. Others worried that state involvement would bring new regulations. A few even suggested that if I had just let the HOA have partial control of the lake, none of this would have happened. It was easier for them to rewrite history than to face it. Then something happened that no one expected. A notice arrived from the county, not addressed to me, but to the HOA itself. A full state-level audit was being launched, not just into Cordelia's actions, but into every major decision the board had made during her tenure. Every fine, every lien, every quiet vote held behind closed doors. The community split almost overnight. One group felt vindicated. They believed the truth should come out, no matter how uncomfortable it became. The other group wanted it all to stop. They were tired of headlines, tired of tension, tired of being reminded that they had allowed one person too much power for too long. And somehow I became the symbol of that divide. At the hardware store one morning, a man I barely knew placed a hand on my shoulder. His voice was low, careful. "You won," he said. "Why can't you just let it end?" I looked at him and answered honestly, "Because it didn't end for everyone when the verdict came down. Some people lost years, some lost savings, some lost sleep. That doesn't disappear just because we're tired of talking about it." He didn't argue. He just walked away. That evening, standing on the dock again, I thought about my great-grandfather, the man who first claimed these water rights, not for power, but for stewardship. He believed that responsibility passed down, along with land, that protecting something meant enduring discomfort when it mattered. The appeal was pending. The audit was underway. The community was uneasy. And I understood now that justice has an aftershock. It shakes relationships, it tests convictions, it asks whether people truly want fairness or simply quiet. As the sun dipped below the trees and the lake darkened, one truth became clear. The hardest part of standing up had never been facing Cordelia. It was standing firm when the fight stopped being loud and started being lonely. The weeks following the court ruling were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, Mirror Lake was shifting. People who had once greeted each other with warm smiles now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped midway, replaced by uneasy silence. The verdict had cleared the legal air, but it had not healed the emotional wounds left by years of manipulation, fear, and mistrust. Some neighbors celebrated quietly. They visited the dock, watched their children play by the water, and shared stories of past summers, breathing in a sense of relief they had almost forgotten. They had witnessed injustice overturned, and it filled them with cautious hope. But not everyone shared that optimism. Another group, once quiet supporters, once indifferent onlookers, now whispered anxiously. They feared what the ongoing state audit might uncover, worried about new regulations, fines, and the long-term implications for their property values. Their discussions were measured, cautious, as if voicing an opinion might ignite conflict. Soon, these private fears began to manifest in subtle social divisions. I found myself in the middle. Friends and neighbors approached with questions and advice, sometimes conflicting, sometimes accusatory. "Why push so hard?" one asked. "Couldn't you have settled?" Another voice chimed in. "At least now we know the truth. We can finally move forward." Each conversation revealed a fracture in the community that had lain dormant for years. Mavis Lane, ever vigilant, convened a small meeting at her home. She invited longtime residents who had been most affected by Cordelia's reign. Sitting around her worn kitchen table, we discussed the challenges ahead. "Victory in court doesn't mean the fight is over," she said firmly, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "We need to rebuild trust. We need to make sure the HOA cannot manipulate this community again." Tommy, who had become both confidant and legal strategist, spread the audit documents across the table. "The state will check every record," he explained. "Every financial transaction, every meeting, every decision under Cordelia's leadership. This could take months. The process will be tedious, and it will create tension. Be ready for pushback." Even with the evidence in our favor, there was a constant undertone of anxiety. Residents began to choose sides, often unconsciously. Some rallied around the legitimacy of the legal victory, fully trusting that transparency would restore fairness. Others aligned with those wary of exposing themselves further, hesitant to upset the fragile status quo. The subtle divisions became visible in the smallest interactions, at the grocery store, at church, and even along the lakefront paths where neighbors had once walked freely together. The appeal filed by Cordelia added fuel to the unrest. Though her legal chances were slim, the very act of filing an appeal reignited old fears. Letters were circulated, both public and private, questioning past management decisions and hinting at supposed instability. Rumors spread faster than facts, and suddenly the community was caught between relief and unease. Amid this turbulence, I noticed the emotional toll it took on individuals. Longtime residents who had endured harassment now faced renewed anxiety over their property and their standing within the neighborhood. Families that had supported the fight quietly struggled with the attention it brought, the gossip, and the lingering worry that justice alone could not fully restore normalcy. Even I felt the strain. Standing on the dock at dusk, watching the water catch the final light of day, I recognized a heavy truth. Winning in court was only part of the battle. The larger, quieter struggle lay in repairing trust, rebuilding relationships, and navigating a community now fractured by fear, suspicion, and the uneven echoes of years of oppression. It was during one of these reflective evenings that Mavis pulled me aside. Her sharp eyes softened. "Ezra, don't underestimate what people carry with them," she said. "Even when you're right, fear lingers. Some may never fully trust again. Your job isn't just to enforce rights, it's to lead with patience. Her words lingered, and I realized the challenge ahead was far greater than the courtroom. The fight for justice had exposed human vulnerabilities, pride, fear, doubt, and the lingering memory of intimidation. While legal authority had been restored, social harmony required empathy, strategy, and a commitment to long-term guidance. That night, as I installed a new security camera on the dock to ensure no further tampering or threats, I reflected on the unspoken battles within the community. The lake itself was serene, unchanged by human divisions, but the people around it were learning painfully and deliberately how fragile trust can be. Months passed, and the appeal that had once loomed over Mirror Lake finally reached its conclusion. Cordelia Blackwood's attempts to overturn the verdict were dismissed entirely. The courts had little reason to reconsider after evidence so thorough and undeniable. The finality of the ruling brought more than legal closure. It allowed the community to begin healing from years of fear, manipulation, and uncertainty. With the legal battles behind us, the real work of restoration began. I stood once again on my great-grandfather's dock, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and water, and realized that the lake itself had endured longer than any of our disputes. The shoreline was unchanged, the water clear and steady. If the land could endure centuries, so could the people, if given the right guidance. Mavis Lane, now elected president of the HOA, with full community support, began overseeing the reorganization of the board. This time, every decision required transparency, documented votes, and open communication. Long-neglected maintenance funds were restored, budgets clarified, and trust rebuilt brick by brick. Residents who had once felt powerless now had a voice, and meetings were filled with respectful dialogue rather than fear-driven silence. The financial restitution from Cordelia's seized assets provided immediate relief. Homeowners received reimbursement for unjust fines, while the HOA's reserve fund was replenished. Families who had been targeted and harassed felt the tangible effects of justice, security, and validation beyond what the law alone could provide. Even small gestures, like restoring shared spaces and repairing the damage done to landscaping around the lake, had an outsized emotional impact. People began to smile again, to greet one another without hesitation, to reclaim the sense of community that had been overshadowed by years of intimidation. But perhaps the most profound change came from the water rights themselves. Mirror Lake was placed into a conservation trust, guaranteeing that its natural resources and historical legacy would be protected for generations. Fishing, boating, and recreation were organized under guidelines that balanced enjoyment with preservation. Local school children began visiting regularly, learning about environmental stewardship, the history of the lake, and the importance of fairness and accountability. The lake had become a symbol not only of land ownership, but of moral responsibility, teaching lessons far deeper than property boundaries. As for me, the fight had reshaped my own understanding of leadership and resilience. The lake, the dock, and the surrounding land were more than inheritance. They were a living responsibility. I worked alongside Tommy, Deputy Roy, Mavis, and other residents to establish ongoing oversight committees, ensuring that the mistakes and abuses of the past could never happen again. What had begun as a struggle to defend personal property evolved into a broader mission, safeguarding a community and its history. Families who had once avoided each other now celebrated together. Children splashed freely in the water without fear of arbitrary fines. Neighbors shared meals, organized festivals, and exchanged stories under the long shadows of the pines. What had been a divided, fearful community became a unified, vibrant one. The lake no longer just reflected sunlight, it reflected the renewed spirit of the people around it. Standing on the dock one late afternoon, the water golden under the setting sun, I reflected on the journey. Victory had not been instantaneous. Justice had come slowly, painfully, and often uncomfortably. But it had arrived, and it carried with it lessons more lasting than any legal ruling. Authority without accountability is dangerous, but ordinary people armed with patience, integrity, and determination can reclaim fairness and dignity. Mirror Lake, once the silent witness to bullying and corruption, had become a testament to courage, perseverance, and moral triumph. And as families laughed, children played, and the wind whispered through the pines, I realized the most enduring victory was not the court's verdict, it was the restoration of trust, community, and the enduring legacy of doing what is right, even when the world seems to conspire against you. By the time Cordelia Blackwood called for what she labeled an emergency community safety meeting, the truth was already straining against its restraints. You could feel it in the air around Mirror Lake, an uneasiness that settled into people's chests and refused to leave. Conversation stopped when certain names were mentioned. Neighbors who once waved now watched from behind curtains. Fear had become part of daily life, and Cordelia was counting on it to carry her through one final act of control. The notice itself was impossible to ignore. Bright red lettering, urgent language, words like immediate, irreversible, community protection. It warned that unless decisive action was taken, property values would collapse and environmental damage would become permanent. Buried beneath the panic was her boldest claim yet, that the HOA had the authority to seize control of lake-adjacent properties under an emergency measure similar to eminent domain. To most people, it sounded official enough to be true. To Tommy, it sounded like desperation wrapped in theater. She's gambling everything, he said, reading the notice twice. This is illegal from top to bottom, and she knows it. That was the moment we understood there was no turning back. Cordelia wasn't testing boundaries anymore. She was attempting to bulldoze them in full view of the community, hoping speed and fear would overwhelm reason. Deputy Roy agreed to be present, not officially, not yet, but close enough to intervene if things went sideways, and everyone knew they would. The night of the meeting, the community center felt different, brighter, tighter. Television lights flooded the room, casting sharp shadows against the walls. A local news crew had been invited, and their presence alone lent Cordelia's claims an air of legitimacy she desperately needed. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly. Elderly residents clutched purses and whispered anxiously. Younger families stood along the walls, unsure whether to sit or flee. No one laughed. No one lingered casually. This wasn't a meeting, it was a reckoning. Cordelia stood at the front, dressed impeccably, posture rigid, expression carefully controlled. Behind her, large poster boards displayed diagrams, timelines, and alarming phrases in bold type. She waited until the cameras were rolling before she began. Her voice was calm, measured, almost soothing. She spoke of responsibility, of leadership, of hard decisions that no one wanted to make, but someone had to. She gestured toward images of my dock, the lake, the shoreline, framing them as hazards rather than heritage. This community, she said, pausing for effect, is under threat. You could see heads nodding, not because they agreed, but because fear was easier than understanding. Then she announced the motion, an emergency vote granting the HOA temporary control over lake access and adjacent properties until risks were resolved. That was when I stood up. The sound of my chair scraping the floor echoed louder than it should have. The room went silent, cameras pivoting instinctively. Point of order, I said evenly. Cordelia's eyes flickered. Just for a moment. But it was enough. Before she could dismiss me, Tommy stepped forward, briefcase in hand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply opened the case and began laying documents on the table, slowly, deliberately. Before this community votes on powers it does not legally possess, Tommy said, there are facts everyone here deserves to know. The tension snapped. He began with the finances. Clear numbers, simple explanations. Money paid out without votes, consulting fees tied to shell companies, accounts connected back to Cordelia herself. Gasps rippled through the room. Cordelia tried to interrupt. Claimed lies, claimed misunderstandings, But the documents didn't argue, they simply existed. Then came the development agreements, quietly secured, privately negotiated, contingent on water control. That was when the room changed. Fear gave way to anger. Residents stood up one by one. Voices shook as years of frustration poured out. Seniors who'd been fined into silence, families pushed to the edge, people who had trusted her. Deputy Roy stepped forward then, no longer just observing. "Miss Blackwood," he said clearly, "I have reason to believe serious crimes have been committed." The cameras captured everything, the color draining from her face, the tremor in her hands, the moment control finally slipped away. Cordelia didn't confess. She lashed out. She accused. She shouted. She blamed everyone else. And in doing so, she confirmed everything. When the handcuffs closed around her wrists, the sound cut through the room like a gavel striking stone. Some people cried. Others stared in stunned silence. A few let out breaths they'd been holding for years. There was no applause, no cheering, just a heavy collective realization. The woman who ruled through fear had been exposed by her own excess. As she was led away, the cameras kept rolling. Not because this was entertainment, but because this was accountability. And while Cordelia's world collapsed in that moment, something else began to rise in its place. Relief. But justice was not finished yet. The verdict still awaited. The weeks following Cordelia Blackwood's arrest felt strangely quiet, as if Mirror Lake itself were holding its breath. After months of pressure, threats, and escalating fear, the sudden absence of her voice left a hollow space that no one quite knew how to fill. The violation notices stopped. The emails stopped. The phone calls stopped. For the first time in a long while, mornings arrived without dread. But silence did not mean resolution. Justice, especially the kind that truly matters, moves slowly. And for a community that had lived under intimidation for years, waiting was its own kind of test. The investigation expanded quickly. What began as an HOA dispute unfolded into something much larger: financial crimes, abuse of authority, harassment and fraud. State auditors combed through records that should have been transparent from the start. Each box of documents confirmed what residents had long suspected but never been able to prove. Cordelia had used fear as a smokescreen while quietly helping herself to their money. When the court date was announced, the courtroom filled beyond capacity. Elderly couples sat side by side, hands folded tightly in their laps. Young families crowded the back rows. Some people had driven hours just to be there, because this wasn't just about one woman anymore. It was about whether power could be held accountable when it hid behind procedure and polished language. Cordelia entered the courtroom without the confidence she once carried so easily. The designer blazer was still there, but it no longer looked like armor. Her posture was stiff. Her gaze avoided the gallery. For the first time, she was not in control of the room. The prosecution laid out the case methodically. No dramatics, no raised voices, just facts, presented one by one, each one heavier than the last. Unauthorized transfers, shell companies, HOA funds used for personal development deals, targeted enforcement against residents who questioned her decisions, fabricated environmental reports designed to justify unlawful seizures. Every claim was supported, every document traced, every pattern explained. When the judge asked if the defense had a response, Cordelia's attorney spoke briefly about misunderstandings, about administrative errors, about intent. But intent matters less when harm is proven, and harm had been proven in abundance. Then came the moment no one would forget. The judge leaned forward, removed his glasses, and spoke slowly, deliberately, ensuring every word carried its full weight. This court finds that the defendant abused her position of trust in a manner both systematic and severe. The room was utterly silent. He continued, outlining the consequences: restitution of all misappropriated funds, personal liability for damages, permanent removal from any HOA leadership role, and referral for criminal sentencing on multiple counts of fraud and theft. Cordelia stared straight ahead as if refusing to hear it. But the most powerful moment came next. All fines, liens and enforcement actions initiated under Miss Blackwood's authority during the period in question are hereby declared null and void. A ripple passed through the courtroom. Some people gasped. Others pressed hands to their mouths. A few quietly wept. Years of fear erased in a single sentence. Then the judge addressed the water rights. The court affirms that the inherited water and land rights predating the HOA remain fully valid and enforceable. No homeowners association has authority over them. That was it. Not just a victory for me, but for everyone who had been told to sit down, pay up, and stay quiet. As Cordelia was led out, there was no anger left in the room, just a deep collective release. People stood slowly, exchanging looks of disbelief and relief. Strangers nodded at one another like survivors of the same long storm. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Conversations flowed easily for the first time in months. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years found themselves standing together, realizing that none of them had been alone, only isolated. Justice hadn't just punished wrongdoing, it had restored dignity. But the story wasn't over yet. Because what comes after justice matters just as much as the verdict itself. And Mirror Lake still needed to heal. 6 months after the verdict, I stood on the same dock where this entire ordeal began. The water was calm that morning, smooth enough to reflect the sky like polished glass. Pine trees whispered softly along the shoreline, the way they always had, indifferent to human conflict, yet somehow bearing witness to all of it. The lake hadn't changed, but the people around it had. Mirror Lake no longer felt tense. It felt human again. The Homeowners Association held new elections under county supervision, this time with rules that favored transparency over control. Mavis Lane was elected president unanimously, though she insisted she was only there to keep the lights on and the bullies out. Meetings became shorter, quieter, and something remarkable happened. People started talking to each other instead of at each other. The financial recovery surprised everyone. Funds seized from Cordelia's personal assets were returned to the community, restoring the HOA's reserves and refunding residents who had been unfairly fined. For many elderly homeowners living on fixed incomes, those checks meant more than money. They meant validation, proof that what they endured had been wrong. The water rights were placed into a conservation trust, protected, documented, and shared responsibly. Access was restored with clear guidelines rooted in respect for both nature and history. Children fished from the shoreline without fear of citations. Families picnicked where tension once lingered. Tommy's legal career took off in ways none of us anticipated. He became known as the lawyer who stood up to HOA overreach, helping other communities find their voices. Deputy Roy was promoted, though he insisted the real reward was seeing neighbors stop looking over their shoulders. As for me, I found peace in stewardship. I wasn't just defending land anymore, I was protecting a legacy. The dock now carries a small plaque honoring my great-grandfather and the values he built into this place: foresight, fairness, and quiet strength. On summer evenings, the community gathers near the water. Laughter drifts across the lake. Conversations stretch long after sunset. People bring chairs, stories, and sometimes just silence shared comfortably. The moral of it all is simple. Authority without accountability becomes tyranny. But when ordinary people stand together, calmly, truthfully, and without fear, justice has room to breathe. If you're watching this and facing pressure that feels unfair, remember this: power only lasts as long as no one questions it. The moment truth steps into the light, even the loudest bully has to listen. And sometimes, if you stay long enough, you get to see something better take its place. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. The day I inherited the water rights to a 2,100-acre lake, I thought I'd won the lottery. What I actually got was a war with the most vindictive HOA president who'd ever lived. I'm standing on my great-grandfather's 1887 dock, breathing in that sweet pine and lake water smell when this white Escalade screeches up my gravel drive. Out steps Cordelia Blackwood, perfectly coiffed designer blazer, clutching a violation notice like it's the Constitution itself. 500 monthly lake access fee, dock removal, immediately. Here's what made my blood boil. She's demanding I pay her to access my 2,000 acres of inherited water rights. But Cordelia didn't know about the original deed in my jacket, the one that made me legally untouchable. What would you do if your HOA tried to steal your water rights inheritance? Where are you watching from? Bet you have HOA horror stories too, because Cordelia is about to lose everything. Let me back up and tell you how I got here. My name's Ezra Whitmore, and 6 months ago, I was just another divorced guy trying to rebuild his life. 42 years old, former Army engineer turned small-town contractor, living in a cramped apartment and wondering where the hell everything went wrong. Then, Uncle Morris died. I'm sitting in lawyer Harold Payton's office, breathing in that musty smell of old legal documents mixed with burnt coffee, when he slides this thick manila envelope across his worn leather desk. The chair cacks under my weight as I lean forward. Your great-grandfather Silas was quite the businessman, Harold says. Bought 2,100 acres around Mirror Lake back in 1887. Water rights, mineral rights, the whole 9 yards. Ezra, you just inherited one of the most valuable properties in 3 counties. The lake itself is pristine, crystal clear water surrounded by towering pines. Some cabins are original family builds from the 1900s. Others are massive McMansions that sprouted up when developers moved in 15 years ago. There's one complication, Harold warns. The Homeowners Association, run by a woman named Cordelia Blackwood, real estate attorney turned HOA dictator. She's been systematically targeting anyone who doesn't fit her country club vision. I should have listened. 3 days later, I'm checking out my new dock when expensive tires crunch on gravel. Out steps a woman who looks like she irons her money. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, designer blazer, and eyes like a lone shark who just spotted fresh prey. You must be the new property owner, she announces, not asking. I'm Cordelia Blackwood, HOA president. She's clutching a violation notice like it's a weapon. Ezra Whitmore. Nice dock, isn't it? My great-grandfather built it. Her smile could make polar bears shiver. This structure violates current safety codes. 30 days removal. Plus, there's a $500 monthly lake access fee. I almost choke. Lady, I own this lake. Community asset, she corrects. Previous owners never properly registered with HOA oversight. She slaps the violation notice against my truck windshield like she's serving a warrant. Failure to comply results in daily fines and potential foreclosure proceedings. Here's the thing about bullies. They always pick the wrong fight eventually. What Cordelia doesn't know is I spent 8 years reading engineering contracts and water management law. More importantly, I've got allies she hasn't counted on. My neighbor Mavis Lane has lived here since before the HOA existed. 78 years old, sharp as a tack, and madder than hell about what Cordelia has been doing to long-time residents. She forced out 3 families last year, Mavis tells me later, her voice shaking with fury. Made up violations, assessed bogus fees until they couldn't afford to fight anymore. Then there's Deputy Roy Hutchkins. Good man, fair cop, and he's been watching Cordelia's selective enforcement for years. She only targets certain types, he mentions quietly. Folks who don't drive the right cars or join the right clubs. And young Tommy Reeves, fresh law school graduate looking to make his mark. Kids eager, hungry, and when I mention water rights from 1887, his eyes light up like Christmas morning. The violation notice is still stuck to my windshield, fluttering in the evening breeze. The crisp paper feels like a declaration of war in my hands. Standing there listening to water lap against century-old dock posts, I realize Cordelia just made a crucial mistake. She picked a fight with an army engineer who knows the difference between legitimate authority and petty tyranny. Someone who's read enough legal documents to know that pre-1900 water rights are basically untouchable. Someone with absolutely nothing left to lose. But mostly, she picked a fight with a guy whose family built this place with their bare hands and who's not about to let some power-hungry real estate lawyer steal it with paperwork and intimidation. Game on, Cordelia. The first thing I learned after inheriting Mirror Lake was that silence can be louder than shouting. For the first week after Cordelia Blackwood slapped that violation notice onto my windshield, no one from the HOA contacted me directly. No emails, No phone calls, no official letters beyond the one already threatening fines and foreclosure. On the surface, it felt almost peaceful, but beneath that quiet was something heavier, like the moment before a summer storm when the air turns thick and birds suddenly stop singing. I spent those early days walking the property slowly, deliberately, letting the land remind me why this fight mattered. I traced the shoreline where my great-grandfather once fished with a simple wooden pole. I ran my fingers along the old dock posts, worn smooth by more than a century of waves and weather. This place had survived floods, droughts, wars and economic crashes. It wasn't just land, it was history, and now somehow it was being treated like a line item on an HOA spreadsheet. But Cordelia was not the type to retreat quietly. She was the kind of person who believed authority existed simply because she said it did. 3 days after our encounter, the pressure began. It started with letters, thick ones, certified. Each envelope carried the unmistakable weight of intimidation, formal language, legal phrasing, and an undertone that said, "You should be afraid." One demanded a full property survey at my expense. Another required an environmental compliance audit. A third warned that failure to cooperate would result in escalating daily penalties. The numbers were designed to overwhelm. Thousands of dollars here, tens of thousands there. Enough to scare an ordinary person into submission before they ever thought to question whether the demands were even lawful. That was Cordelia's system. She didn't argue, she buried people. As I read each letter at my kitchen table, I could almost picture her drafting them. Perfect posture, expensive pen, that same tight smile she wore at the dock. To her, this wasn't personal, it was procedure, and procedure was her weapon of choice. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed I was alone. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the water, my neighbor Mavis Lane shuffled up my gravel drive with a plate of cookies and a look that told me she'd been holding something in for a long time. Mavis was 78, widowed and sharper than most lawyers I'd ever met. She'd lived by this lake since before the HOA existed, back when neighbors solved problems with conversations instead of citations. "I heard Cordelia paid you a visit," she said, setting the plate down like she was laying out evidence. I nodded. Mavis exhaled slowly, the way people do when they're tired of pretending. Then it started. Over coffee, she told me what the glossy HOA newsletters never mentioned. How families who'd lived here for decades were suddenly hit with violations for things that had never been an issue before. How fines appeared without warning. How appeals were delayed until people gave up or ran out of money. "She doesn't want compliance," Mavis said quietly. "She wants control, or land." That last word hung between us. It turned out Mavis wasn't the only one watching Cordelia closely. Deputy Roy Hutchkins stopped by the next morning under the pretense of a routine patrol. Roy was a steady man, the kind who spoke carefully and listened more than he talked. He didn't accuse anyone outright, but his words were clear enough. "Funny thing about those complaints," he said, glancing toward the lake. "They seem to follow certain folks. Same pattern, same handwriting, metaphorically speaking." He didn't need to say Cordelia's name. By the end of that week, I realized something important. This wasn't just my fight. I was stepping into a conflict that had been building quietly for years, one resident at a time, always just below the surface. And Cordelia knew it. That's when she escalated. An emergency HOA meeting was announced with less than 24 hours' notice. Attendance marked as mandatory. The subject line read, "Unauthorized lake use and community safety concerns." The wording was deliberate, vague enough to sound serious, alarming enough to draw a crowd. I didn't go alone. Tommy Reeves met me outside the community center, carrying a briefcase and the kind of nervous excitement only a young lawyer gets when he senses history about to happen. Fresh out of law school, still paying off student loans, but already obsessed with property law and old deeds most people considered boring relics. When I showed him the 1887 document, his entire posture changed. "These aren't just old papers," he said earlier that week, eyes wide. "These are foundations. They outrank almost everything." Inside the meeting hall, Cordelia stood at the front like a judge preparing to pass sentence. Charts lined the walls. Enlarged photographs of my dock were displayed as if they were crime scene evidence. She spoke calmly, confidently, explaining how unauthorized structures and unregulated water access threatened the community's future. People nodded, some out of fear, some out of habit. Then Tommy stood up. The room shifted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He simply asked one question after another, measured, polite, impossible to dismiss. Under what statute did the HOA claim authority over pre-existing water rights? Where was the vote approving enforcement fees on inherited property? Why were residents never informed of jurisdictional limits? Cordelia tried to brush him off, called the deed a technicality, said the HOA had long-standing recognition. But technicalities are the law's backbone, and recognition without authority is just assumption dressed up as power. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flash across her face. The meeting ended abruptly. No vote, no resolution, just a declaration that the board would review the matter. But something had changed. People stayed behind afterward, whispering, asking questions, looking at Cordelia not as an untouchable authority figure, but as a person who might actually be wrong. As we stepped outside, Tommy leaned toward me and said quietly, "She didn't expect resistance." And then something happened that no one expected. 2 days later, county inspectors arrived. Building, environmental, septic, all at once. They were polite, professional, but their presence was unmistakably aggressive. This wasn't routine, this was pressure. Cordelia hadn't backed down. She'd gone around us. But as they measured, tested and documented, something else became clear. My property wasn't the problem. Everything passed inspection. In fact, several inspectors admitted it was better maintained than most of the newer developments around the lake. Deputy Roy took note, and I took notes too, because when someone pushes this hard without evidence, it usually means they're afraid of what the truth might reveal. And Cordelia Blackwood was about to learn that intimidation only works when no one dares to stand still long enough to look closely. The lines had been drawn, and this was only the beginning. Next, more expanded Cordelia Blackwood began crossing them, one calculated step at a time. The inspections should have ended the matter. Any reasonable person, seeing clean reports from county officials, would have stepped back and reassessed. But Cordelia was not reasonable. She was cornered, and cornered people don't look for truth, they look for leverage. The very next morning after the inspectors left, my phone began ringing with unfamiliar numbers. Each call followed the same script. Polite voices, professional tones, requests for clarification and cooperation. Every conversation circled back to one point: voluntary compliance would make this easier for everyone. That phrase, "easier for everyone," is how pressure disguises itself as kindness. When I didn't agree, the tone changed. Emails arrived with subject lines written in capital letters. Notices were reposted on the HOA bulletin board, each one slightly more alarming than the last. Neighbors who had never spoken to me before suddenly avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Someone started whispering that I was threatening property values. Another rumor claimed I was planning to sell water access to outside developers. None of it was true, but lies don't need truth when repetition does the work for them. Then, something unsettling began to emerge. Deputy Roy stopped by again one evening, this time not in uniform. He leaned against the tailgate of my truck and spoke quietly, choosing his words with care. "You're not the only one getting attention," he said. "Complaints are popping up all over. Same timing, same language, different targets." It wasn't just about me anymore. Long-time residents, people like Mavis, were suddenly being cited again. Old violations reopened, new fines imposed. Families who had spoken up at the HOA meeting found violation notices taped to their doors within days. It was a pattern, and patterns tell stories. Tommy dove deeper. He requested HOA records, financial summaries, meeting minutes, anything public, anything traceable. What he found didn't make sense at first. Legal expenses were skyrocketing, yet no votes had been recorded to approve them. Consulting fees were listed without descriptions. Payments were being made to outside entities no one recognized. "Either she's reckless," Tommy said one night, "papers spread across my kitchen table, or she thinks no one will ever check." That's when the twists began coming faster. First, Mavis showed up with news that made my stomach tighten. "Cordelia's been talking about development," she said. "Big talk. Luxury lakefront improvements, investors, promises. Development required one thing above all else: control. Not just of land, but of water." Then Tommy uncovered something that shifted the entire fight. An old survey map, faded lines, forgotten easements. Cordelia's own dock, her boathouse, her shoreline improvements, sat partially on land my family owned outright, for years, unchallenged. "That means she's been trespassing," Tommy said carefully, "and the HOA never disclosed it." The irony was almost painful. The woman accusing everyone else of violations was standing on land she had no legal right to use. And then, because tension never waits politely, Cordelia escalated again. This time, she claimed authority over the lake's water levels themselves. An emergency notice declared an environmental risk and announced that the HOA would temporarily assume water management oversight. It was bold, it was alarming, and it was completely unlawful. But most residents didn't know that. Fear rippled through the community. Seniors worried about access. Families worried about property value. People whispered about droughts and restrictions. Cordelia knew exactly what she was doing, but she didn't know who she was dealing with, because I had spent years working with water systems where mistakes cost lives. And Mirror Lake wasn't some artificial reservoir. It was spring-fed, stable, documented. Its behavior recorded long before Cordelia ever learned to spell HOA. When I found the old water control mechanisms hidden near the shoreline, ironwork from the 19th century still solid beneath my hands, I felt something shift. My great-grandfather hadn't just bought land, he'd built foresight into it. And then came the media. A local paper ran a story quoting Cordelia's hired consultant, painting me as an irresponsible landowner. The report sounded impressive until you actually read it. Vague claims, no data, no measurements. Tommy drafted a response so precise it read like a quiet dismantling. Facts, dates, science, and just when it seemed like things couldn't intensify further, they did. A private investigator appeared, badly hidden, nervous, watching. Then, one night, someone tried to sabotage my dock. The cameras caught everything. That was the moment I understood. Cordelia wasn't just abusing authority anymore. She was panicking. And panic makes people sloppy, very sloppy. By the time the private investigator approached me with evidence of intimidation orders, surveillance contracts and payment records, the picture was undeniable. This wasn't mismanagement, it was corruption. And Cordelia had left a trail. She thought pressure would break me. Instead, it revealed her. And now the tension wasn't just building, it was about to snap, because the next move wouldn't happen quietly, it would happen in public.